Grief is a portal. And I don't mean the spiritual woo-woo idea of what a portal could be. This swirling vortex of light and energy. A Narnia type thing where you walk through a wardrobe and you leave one world and you enter this magical space. I'm sure for some people it could be like that. But for me, it's not. And for many other people, it won't necessarily be that either. But to understand this concept of grief being a portal, we first need to define what a portal is. And the definition of a portal is a doorway, a gate, or another entrance, especially a large and imposing one. And if we think about a portal like that, and we think about somebody moving through a portal, we can imagine somebody in one state, beginning as one person, one type of being, moving through a gateway and coming out the other side. Grief is not an ending. Rather, it's not the end. It is an ending, of course. But as with all endings, even seasonally, we can see the ending of winter is the beginning of spring. The ending of spring is the beginning of summer. The ending of summer is the beginning of autumn. The ending of autumn is then the beginning of winter. And so on and so on. And so a portal then becomes a shift where the person that enters the portal is not necessarily the person that comes out the other side. And the world on the other side of this portal, this doorway, this gateway, this entrance, is a different sort of world, because there exists a being in this new world, or maybe the same world, but with different eyes to see. And when we have the eyes to see something that we couldn't see before, we are entering a new layer of perception. And so some spiritualists would call this timeline jumping or a timeline shift. Some Wiccans or witches or magical beings, people that practice a spiritual craft of sorts, might describe a portal as being a very magically heightened time where you're leaving one version of yourself behind and entering a higher dimension. There's so many different ways to describe this, but really it is a shift in perception. It's a shift in identity. It's a shift in understanding and awareness and experience. And alongside many other experiences in life, grief is a portal. Marriage can be a portal, a relationship, a new job, moving to a new country. So many things that allow us to access different pieces of who we are could be labeled as a portal. And it doesn't need to be a flighty or woo-woo idea. It could be a very grounded, real, and practical experience of a shift and a change. I've listened to podcast episodes and read books. I've had conversations with people that act as portals for me, where I leave with a whole new awareness and understanding and comprehension of who I am, why I am the way I am, why I think the way I think, where I can understand and hold tenderly the world in a different capacity, in a different way. And so when I speak about grief being a portal, if we allow it to be, if we allow it to be, because we don't always allow it. We don't always welcome the change. Sometimes we do our best to grip onto things and have them stay the same. The image in my head is that of somebody walking through a door on a winter day. And the door is a portal from one state to another. And you can choose to go from the inside state, the inside world, to the outside world. And I'm picturing a winter day because inside the home, inside the building, on one side of the door, would be a lot warmer than the other side of the door. And so you might be wearing a t-shirt or a long sleeve sweater or a tank top or a dress. And for those that choose to not honor the portal or the shift that takes place from one side of the door to the other, they might be very uncomfortable. Can you imagine being in a flowy dress or a tank top and shorts inside, and you open the door and you stand outside, and it's minus 20 degrees and you're freezing outside? And of course, there's going to be resistance and feelings of being uncomfortable because you're standing outside and you're not allowing the change to be embodied. In this case, it would be to put on a winter coat and wear appropriate clothing so that you are more comfortable in this new terrain. Whereas having a coat on your body when you're inside in a warm house wouldn't be necessary. But entering into a colder world, the other side of that portal, you're required to do different things in order to maintain a sense of homeostasis and comfortability. And so when you move through a portal, there is an invitation to change, to adapt, to build your resilience in a different capacity. And grief invites that of us. We are being asked to access different parts of ourselves and at times show up differently than we were showing up before. And depending on how deep this is, because there are variabilities and there are degrees of the depth of grief that we can feel, right? The ending of a life, a young life in particular, can be more difficult to navigate and adapt, and that can be a challenging portal to walk through in comparison to maybe a seasonal shift for someone like me who doesn't have allergies, right? So we're coming from winter, entering spring, and I don't have allergies, and so the shift for me is more pleasant. That portal is more welcomed. I feel more curious and open to engage with the shift from winter to spring. Somebody with seasonal allergies might feel more complexities with that shift. And so we can't compare portals as black and white, but we can recognize what feels differently in our own bodies when we engage with different types of portals. And of course, grief can show up in a variety of ways. Grief is just the experience of loss and the experience of the death of something. We can grieve who we once were. We can grieve a job that we had. We can grieve a life that we never got to live. We can grieve the life of somebody who's passed away. We can grieve so many different things. And so grief is not just the death of what once was alive. there are many things that grief will touch, and we will grieve continuously through our lives. And grief is not a thing that ends. It's not, it doesn't have an ending. You know, when we're grieving something, we oftentimes end up grieving it for the rest of our life, you know, and some things we're able to move through easier, and some things, depending on the depth of the grief, won't necessarily affect us in the same way. But the deeper the grief, the more lifelong impacting the grief will be. And so grief will invite us to walk through many, 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 many portals. It is not just one doorway or one gateway that we walk through, and who we are on the other side of that is who we will remain. In my case, there are many doorways that the grief and the loss of my son is asking me to walk through. Many versions of myself that I no longer am, that there isn't space for. Many invitations for me to show up differently. Because when grief is also coupled with trauma, that becomes an even bigger portal, an even bigger gateway. And trauma also on its own, which it never stands alone. It's always commingled with anger and, you know, sadness and grief and all sorts of things, each its own blend, right? Every trauma, quote unquote, big capital T trauma, little not capital T trauma, can all be portals, and they're all unique, and their experiences of them are all unique. And so this particular loss that I am navigating, the trauma, the loss, the grief, the death, continues to invite me to show up differently in every wave of anger or rage, every bout of depression or sadness or longing or guilt or shame, all the emotions that come with grief and trauma. Invite me to view things differently. And in many ways, I've described trauma like this, and I've heard other people describe trauma like this, where there is the before, insert traumatic event, and there is the after, insert traumatic event. And I see myself as that in a lot of ways, and that perspective also might change. There's going to be other portals that exist, other conversations that happen with different people, different daydreams or thought processes, ceremonies that I enter that can become portals for change, for healing, to access different layers of the medicine woven within each experience. And so portals in a lot of ways can be medicine. But who I was, what my life was before the death of my son, and who I am after the death of my son, they are not the same. And I often wonder if they were to sit and have coffee together, or tea, or a cold pressed juice, or dinner, or just sit and talk. I wonder what their conversations would sound like. I wonder how they would engage together, because even though there is this before and after, and I am no longer that woman, all of her experiences rather, still live inside of me. All of who she was still exists in my being. Who she used to be lives within this new woman that I'm getting to know. Because I don't know really who she is yet. I'm watching her engage in conflict differently. I'm watching her show up to life differently. I'm watching things that used to interest her dissolve away. I'm noticing that sometimes she'll respond to situations and then pause and think, that doesn't feel accurate for me anymore. And so she's actively rewiring, but also the rewiring is happening and she's noticing this as it's happening. So it's a very interesting dynamic. And I wonder how many more portals, and of course we can't know, but I do wonder how many more portals she'll enter. And I can even reflect on therapy sessions where I walked in and maybe a conversation happened or a really big process happened or an awareness or an understanding hits me. And I leave and I'm walking around town or walking in the forest and I'm in awe. And that brings me to these aha moments. These little mini portals. These aha moments that exist when we're reading a book or chatting with a friend or we're in therapy. And sometimes these are mini portals that turn out to be really big portals. And sometimes they're little portals that snowball or have a domino effect and become a big portal, or sometimes it's just a compilation of little baby portals, little doorways that accumulate, and you realize in retrospect, wow, that was a massive portal. That was a big shift. And grief, death, loss, I mean, every bleed a woman has even can be a portal. And again, I really want to reiterate this this understanding that a portal doesn't need to be this spiritual, lofty idea of let's set intentions and you know, do a spell and manifest, you know, and not that any of those things are lofty, you know, that can be a very healing thing for a lot of people to show up and do manifestation practices or say affirmations. But a lot of the time, I've noticed there's a depth that is lacking. And grief as a portal is one of the biggest portals that we will walk through, especially grief that is just so deep that it's not understood by the mind. It's only understood by those who have walked that path, that particular path. You know, I'll talk with women who've lost children, who've experienced stillbirth. And we understand things differently. And it's not to say that people that haven't experienced that can't understand other depths, but I don't know what it's like to lose my mother or father as a child. That's not a portal I've walked through. It's not an initiation that I've experienced. And so those that have experienced that, when they talk to one another, they can speak of that portal of who they were before, who they used to be, and who they are now. The person that existed before they walked through that portal versus the person that they are now. And we experience this in so many ways. There are longer term portals, and there are more immediate, shorter term portals, more acute portals, more chronic portals. You know, I've talked to people that have experienced long-term illness and the person that they were before that illness versus after. Most people, women especially, when I think of puberty, you know, and you first get your menstrual cycle and you know, you're developing breasts and body hair and all of these things. You know, puberty takes a very long time, or even pregnancy is a portal. That's a whole journey in itself, because you are the physical embodiment of a portal. You know, in puberty, on one hand, your body, your physicality is changing, and so you can see, and everyone around you can see who you were versus who you are, and the shift that takes place and the messiness that happens in this portal space. In pregnancy, your body changes as well, and your hormones actually shift a lot more in a shorter span of time than they do in puberty. So it's quite powerful and potent and intense in a lot of ways. But you are also becoming a portal for another being. You are not just the embodiment for your own transformation, but you become the doorway, the gateway. You become the portal. And when that portal is disturbed in something like miscarriage or stillbirth, and when I say disturbed, I also don't mean wrong, you know, because miscarriage and stillbirth happens all the time in nature, with every creature, with plants and animals. It doesn't discriminate. And so when I say disturbed, I just mean life does not become the outcome or the result of this portal. And that sometimes happens with portals. Very often, you know, in various circumstances. Ideas can be a portal where you have an idea and you think, that's a world-changing, life-changing idea. I must do it. And then it just doesn't happen. And that's okay. And then other ideas do happen and do result in really profound changes and shifts and positive impact or negative impact. But when a pregnancy is disturbed and it doesn't result in a baby and the woman becomes the portal, sometimes there can be these ideas of the portal failed. I failed. I as a woman, me, my body, we failed. We didn't function properly. And thus begins a very powerful disintegration of the ego, where we are attached in certain ways to what we create, what we put out into the world, be it a baby, an idea. And of course, an idea versus a baby are very, very different things, right? I've had many ideas that did not come into fruition. It does not compare to losing my son, not at all. However, the idea that every single baby makes it through the birth portal, makes it through 9 months gestation or a full length of gestation, because not every woman is pregnant for 9 months. Some women are pregnant for 10 or 8, and a living baby is still the result. In my case, 42 weeks, 10 months, If you heard that, that was just the raccoons above me playing around. But 42 weeks. And the result was me holding my lifeless little boy in my arms, alongside a cascade of intervention and health issues all year, surgeries, things like that. And I reflect on this insane transformation that I've been through because of all of that. And this idea that, I failed, that I did something wrong, that it's my fault. All of these feelings arise. And I'm looking at the door right now, a door and a window. And I just think of all of these other portals, all of these other doorways, gateways. And of course, it's our responsibility. Make sure if you go outside in the winter, you have your coat. You don't want to be cold. Wear your hat, get your gloves on, put on your boots, all of these things. But we don't blame the winter. We don't condemn the other side of the portal. I mean, sometimes we do. But the portal in itself isn't wrong. It's not bad. One side of the portal versus the other. When we really zoom out, really zoom out, and we sit and hold our hearts with tenderness, there is no good or bad. There is just love and care. Sometimes there isn't love and care, but there can be understanding, and there's always some kind of transformation, some kind of growth, some kind of perspective shift that we wouldn't have otherwise. Because it's one thing to know of the cold, to logically understand, okay, I won't feel as comfortable, so I'm going to put on a coat. It's one thing to know that if I stand outside in minus 40 degrees Celsius weather for long enough, I will freeze. It's another thing to actually go outside and feel the cold and experience the cold. And that's the gift of portals and death as a portal. We cannot understand grief or death, really. We can't understand most things logically until we experience it ourselves, because we are limited by the mind. We are limited in our understanding of grasping the realities of what life can be and what people can experience. I've had so many people tell me about their stories. Some things I can relate to more because I've lived them. Some things I can't. And how many people have told me, wow, Emma, I can't imagine. And I say, no, you can't. Because our minds won't really let us. Even my physical healing journey from injuries and ailments that I sustained in childbirth, the things that I was living with all year, it was difficult for people to hold it because they couldn't grasp it, because it was so far removed from their lived experience. And this is where I was in therapy discussing concepts like this and asking about validation. Why is validation important? And we went on this train of thought because I've had a lot of people in my life in this past year do their best to validate my experiences, to to hear what I have to say. But no one really knows what my journey's been. No one's really understood exactly how I've been feeling. And so they can't validate it. But why is validation so important? And it hit me. I was in therapy last week or the week before, and I heard a story of a woman, a narco Westcott, and I recorded a podcast episode, and I am crying in most of it, and I'm really vulnerably sharing intimate details of what my journey has been, and so it's going to be on the paid version of my Substack, just because it is so intimate. And I couldn't stop crying. And as soon as I heard her story, I couldn't stop crying. I was crying and crying for days. And then I got into therapy, and it was just this overwhelming blubbering of tears. I didn't think I was going to cry that heavily, but it was an uncontrollable, physiological, somatic release. Somatic coming from the root word soma, meaning body. My whole body was just releasing and crying and shaking, and I didn't understand why. But it was because this woman's story had so many parallels to my own, and she was the only woman who really, really got it, who really understood everything I was going through. And I was like, why am I crying so much about this woman who died in 1860 something, 1868, I think it was, like a very long time ago. And it's not just crying because there's this, compassion about what her story is. But what we landed with, me and my therapist, is that I realized I wasn't alone. And that's the beauty of validation. That's the gift of really landing with validation. And I've been discussing this concept of validation with many people, my partner, my friends, all these different people. And what I've realized is that we can't validate something that we don't actually know, that we haven't actually experienced. It doesn't land in the same way. It doesn't anchor into our hearts or into our guts or into our lived experience. Of course we can say, hey, your feelings are valid. Hey, I'm here to listen. But the way that I understood this woman and the physiological reaction that my body had to knowing her story, not even hearing it from her own words. I only know her story from the medical journals that her story was written about in, and a lot of people, a lot of the research, a lot of the videos that I saw would speak about her story saying, wow, I have no idea. I can't imagine what that was like. And I would cry and shake and just scream and whimper that I don't have to imagine. I know what that's like. I know what it's like to be in labor for 3-4 days. I know what it's like to birth a lifeless child. I know what it's like to then have this dysfunctional body afterwards, after a long, traumatic, drawn out birthing experience. I know what it's like to have doctors say, I don't know if we can help you, but we're going to try our best, and then have to go in for many surgeries afterwards. And of course, there are things that are very, very different, and her experiences were vastly different than mine in other ways. She was a woman that was enslaved. She lived in the 1800s. I'm living in, the 21st century. I was able to receive anesthesia for my surgeries. She did not. I was able to receive pain relief. She did not. I was not exploited to experience experimental procedures for someone else's education. I was held and prayed with and cried with and cared for. My experience mattered. Her experience only mattered in the physical sense, where they, doctors wanted to know what her journey was like. And anyway, I'm going off on this tangent to explain that my relationship to this woman, who I will never actually get to meet, was a portal. And so my experience of grief is now this never-ending portal of alchemy and transformation, because my son is not with me, and I will be grieving him for the rest of my life. And when people experience very deep grief or very deep trauma, this is completely an assumption and just a potentially poetic understanding or thought process. But it's my assumption that we remain in a state of alchemy, that we kind of become these portals where we're always in alchemy, always in transformation. We're never not in this portal. And anyone that comes into contact with us and speaks with us ends up listening to our story and moving through their own alchemy and shifting and evolving and seeing things differently and gaining different perspectives, because they have realizations, they have a reality check perhaps that just lands in them, where they go home and they hug their children, or they hug their siblings, or they call their mother and say, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that I love you and I care about you," whatever it might be. But this woman, Anarcha Westcott, has become a portal within a portal, and a being of resource for me, where anytime I need validation or I feel alone, I think of her and I remember, right, I'm not the only one. Even if I never meet another living person who's walked the same path as me or walked even a similar path as me, that's okay. I know she existed. And that's the gift and the beauty of validation, is that we recognize that we're not alone. I'm not the only one. I'm not by myself in this. I'm not shouldering all of this on my own. There is somebody else who gets it, who actually fucking gets it, who understands. And I have felt pieces of this when I speak with other women who have lost children, where we don't even have to exchange words. We just know. I don't have to explain feelings or sensations that I have. There is just a nod of understanding, tears of actual empathy, not sympathy. Empathy is when we really feel and we know what the other person is feeling. Sympathy is, I don't know what you're feeling, but I'm here with you while you feel it. And these points of validation are also portals, right? And so this conversation around what is a portal and how is grief a portal, how is death a portal, how is suffering, period, a portal. And it's a really complex and nuanced experience, but portals really are anything that allows us to change state and evolve and alchemize and transform and understand things differently, show up differently. They allow us to be different. And sometimes meeting somebody that doesn't know my story at all and we can just talk can feel like a portal, because it's as though I'm looking back at who I used to be and saying, "Hey, Emma, hi. It's nice to see you. I remember who you were, and I can give you a little bit of space to be here and to breathe. You don't have to be the woman that is grieving her son all the time. You can just be a woman, even though I can never actually be her again. And that's this entire internal journey, but grief is a miraculous portal where we engage with suffering, not just our own, but the suffering of others in a very unique way. And I remember in the days, weeks, months after my son died, my partner would speak to me and we would discuss, how we're feeling. And he would just say, I feel more connected to the suffering of the world now than I ever have before. And that is such a profound way to phrase this experience, because we really do have this connection point of suffering and other people's suffering, when we're in our own hurt and our own grief. We can better connect to someone else's. We can better understand and hold and care for another while they are suffering. Even if we don't know them, even if we don't talk to them, we can better sit with the suffering of all of humanity. The suffering of people that are living in a war zone right now, or the life of people that are just experiencing a lot of pain. We can just see them and see their wholeness and see ourselves more in them. We recognize that sometimes things are really little and they don't carry as much weight, and we're able to just have greater perspective. And that is one of the pieces of medicine through suffering that I've experienced. One of the silver linings of suffering is this depth of compassion that I have even more than before. When I hear of someone else's pain, I just sink in deeper to it. I can hold it better because I've held myself in those deep, dark places, and there's just such medicine in that. And if we can learn to really show up to ourselves in these places of suffering and hurt, no matter how deep or how shallow, I think we can become those portals. We can become those points of alchemy and transformation, known and unknown, conscious and unconscious. And something that I've been asking myself lately, and I'll ask you and offer this as an invitation or an opportunity or a potential for you. Maybe this conversation can be a portal. By really checking in and asking, what am I moving through right now? And how am I being asked to evolve, to shift, to change, to grow? What am I being asked to alchemize here? Because in every situation, every roadblock, every difficulty, every sorrow, even every minor inconvenience, how can we be asked to show up differently? How are we being asked to show up in new ways? I have the internet guy scheduled for today, and he canceled and put me on for the next day or in the next 2 days. And I'm now being invited into more flexibility and thinking, okay, well, I just had this whole thing planned for this morning. I had to be here and wait around. And then I decided, okay, I could be frustrated, but it's really not the end of the world. What can I do with this time now? And so I took out my phone and remembered this idea of grief as a portal and thought, maybe I'm being asked to be a bit more flexible here. Maybe I can record something. And even if the recording isn't perfect because I heard, some raccoons moving upstairs and there was somebody doing construction outside, and so I heard a drill or whatever it might be called, some hand tool, power tool being used. And even though it's not perfect, even though it's not, anything, it's something. And I've decided to show up imperfectly, very human, and discuss this idea and this concept of grief as a portal, as a point of transformation and evolution. And maybe this can give you an opportunity to understand the portals in your life, the grief in your life that might be asking you or inviting you to evolve, that might be saying, hey, here's an opportunity for growth in some way. And of course, we never want to grow through suffering or pain or sorrow. But as the Tao Te Ching says, we are not special. We are not exempt from suffering. To have a body is to experience misfortune, and that means to be human is to experience misfortune, whether it means stubbing your toe or having your leg amputated or losing your child in childbirth, getting into a car accident, having a scar on your arm from some event, getting fired, whatever it might be. There's so many circumstances that cause pain, that cause hurt, that cause discomfort, and sometimes deep suffering and deep sorrow and deep, 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 deep grief. And while I don't wish that on anyone, I also recognize that the things that I've moved through, the difficulties in my life, the deepest pain, abuse, trauma that I've endured has 100% made me a better person. 100%. And it wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. I mean, just because we go through something difficult, we might come out the other side and cause harm to people. That's very possible. But from what I can see, the hurt that I've experienced, the pain, everything that I've gone through has made me a better person and continues to make me a better person because it opens the door for me to be more compassionate, to be more caring, to be more loving, to hold more people, to strive to be of service in some way, to sit at the feet of other women, children, men, humans, and listen to their story and offer what I can to be a space of solace or refuge or sanctuary. And I know that it continues to teach me that as I go on. That every ounce of suffering I've been through allows me to love deeper. And whatever it is that you have been through, whatever it is that you might end up going through, I pray that for you, that anything you've gone through allows you to be a more loving person. Not a nice person, not a good person, because what the fuck is even that? Those are judgments and preconceived ideas of what that even means, But just a more caring, kind, loving person. And not that you need to suffer in order to be caring or compassionate or kind, but it does offer context. the context to empathizing with the suffering of others, to knowing what suffering can really be like. So when somebody says, hey, I'm at my breaking point, you can think, wow, I remember when I was too. And instead of breaking, I stretched. And I can hold this person while they're in the midst of the most excruciating, painful stretch of their life. And maybe you're not trying to be of service or trying to be a space holder. And that's fine. I just mean as a human, as a person, as a partner, as a lover, as a parent, as a friend, as a community member. Because we don't need to show up in all of the ways for everyone all the time. Sometimes it's just a look where you hold the gaze of somebody in the middle of suffering, and you're not the first one to look away. And you're just holding that for just a moment. Because I know what that long gaze can feel like. And it's the long gaze of, hey, I'm not afraid of your pain or your suffering. I'm not afraid of you or your tears or your anger. It's not too big. It's not too much, even though it can feel that way. I can see your darkness, and I can also see your light, and I will not look away. And that is such a powerful place to be. Even just a 5-second gaze into somebody else's eyes can be such a powerful portal. So thank you for being here and for listening and for engaging, actively engaging in the portals that exist in your life and the grief that exists in your life. I see your light. I see your darkness. And I will not look away.